6, we be in the mix with that rare candy paint job on the whip. I need food for the kids, money for the rent. Fuck a lockdown, baby, I can't do that shit. And I don't never vote, cause I'm fucking broke. And either way, I know the police ain't gon' leave me alone. On a plane, by to visit Glen Rock. Need crypto, told me I should bring the Glock with me. So I packed up my piece and I'm sliding. Cause we might get caught up in a riot. Middle finger Trump, middle finger Biden. Fuck a left, fuck a right, is you riding? Know you love to see it, dudes rocking. Ain't no politics, baby, we just talking. From the birds to the bricks, we be in the mix with that rare candy paint job on the whip. Who you with?
Okay, so we have a special guest. Like I said, we were just discussing off mic when the first time we had him on, but this was in 2020, back when talking about origins of COVID and stuff wasn't exactly. I mean, it wasn't permitted. That episode didn't go on YouTube, I don't think, because I didn't even want to try. It would have got you a strike. Now I guess you can do it. But of course, our guest is Dr. Jonathan Latham here. So how's it been going, man?
Well, I mean, what do you say is an issue, isn't it? I think people are still getting struck off YouTube for talking about the origin question. Somebody was complaining to me the other day that it still happens.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah, and to be fair, like even if you don't get struck down, if you have a media channel that relies on like monetization, they'll just say, look, you can post a video, but you won't receive any sort of income from it. And, obviously it's about getting the message out, but that is a one way of going around it. It still feels weird because I'm hoping to get rid of, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like there's no reason to have gain of function research at any like right now. Is there any lingering benefit of having it around? Because it doesn't seem like a good thing to be having around right now.
Well, I mean, it's tricky because on the one hand, a lot of experiments, people are messing around with if you want to mess around with a live virus, you're going to end up with something that gains a function of some sort, so like, but then you want to be able to do live virus experiments. I imagine I don't know. I mean, they're difficult to justify, right? But the problem is that you can end up there by mistake.
Oh,
right. Like this is a lot of the issue. Is like you put together two viruses or mix them in the same cell, and the conference I went to last, right? There's this guy and he's trying to look at something that has nothing really to do with gain of function. But then he says, it occurred to us that we were mixing two viruses in a cell and some of them are going to be better than either of the parents at doing what they do. And so I decided not to use the word gain of function. So it's like, the researchers are educated enough to know that people are sensitive to this and that there's a very woolly line. Right. And so saying there's no possible benefit is a little tricky because it remove all virus research except for research with partial viruses. Like people can do research with bits of a virus. Like you can just look at the spike protein without it being in a real virus. You can look at any other part without it being in a real virus. And then it's much safer, most people think. And I would agree with them. But then, you're never going to know whether your experiment would have been really true with a real virus. They always want to know. And sometimes there are differences, but then you really are close to a gain of function thing. And I'm open to there being possible experiments, but there's some experiments that are clearly not wise. So I hate to sit on the fence and be non-controversial, but it's a real tricky one. How do you learn stuff without it being somewhat close to reality and so forth? But at the same time, is it possible to say strong things, right? Many of these experiments where people try to adapt viruses to the lungs by and to make them more humanized or make them more lung transmissible. Because, the issue here is that lung transmissibility is the big daddy out of all this, right? What's happening with flu viruses, what's happening with coronaviruses is in their reservoir species, they're in animals that basically where it's fecal oral transmission, right? Fecal oral transmission is not a goer in a human population, right? Everyone washes their hands; they're fairly clean.
Well, you haven't met our audience, so don't say that completely.
Also, don't put that on me. I'm 50-50 when I,
historically speaking, it's not a common thing. Like in this day and age, and even historically, like most, all the cold viruses, all the, many more viruses transmitted through respiratory systems and through the stomach.
Right.
The stomach is like a ridiculously challenging environment, right? Yeah. Like the first thing that happens to you, to a thing that you ingest, is it goes to pH 1 or pH 1.5. It's nasty. And so you have to be a well-built virus to tolerate that. And so learning to adapt to the lungs is the big question in human virology, right? So when people do these experiments where they put a ferret virus and they try to adapt it for respiratory transmission, those are the kind of real big daddy gain of function experiments, because those viruses, then basically become competent for human transmission or thereabouts. And that's the big one. But what's interesting is people hardly ever cite those, right? Like, you do this incredibly dangerous experiment, and then you find it has hardly any citations. Like, it's in Nature magazine or Science magazine with practically no citations, because guess what? We didn't learn anything. Mm-hmm. Right?
Wow. Yeah,
so there's a total mismatch between the danger of experiments very often and what we actually learn and what's useful. It's like people are doing them for show. It's like people are doing them for kudos. It's like they're doing it because it's so dangerous, we can get a Nature paper or a Science paper and advance our careers and not actually learn anything.
And to the consumer side of it, to the average reader, it's in the magazine, therefore that is the citation, and that's that. So it's kind of this institutional trust is what it's based on, and kind of the reinforcement bar underneath it to go, well, it's in the magazine. They wouldn't put it in the magazine if that was the case. So it's kind of a tricky little system that I think we still can't break a lot of people out of,
Well, you've got a very corrupt scientific system where everybody is chasing citations, right? Everybody is chasing Science and Nature publications, and it gives those journals a lot of control over science, right? But if we hired researchers and admired professors because of the cleverness of their research and the innovative things that they do, right? We would have a different kind of scientific system than if we just encourage people to play the game and game the system to get high citations and to get papers in Nature and Science. Science would be totally different.
And it seems to select
people would rise to the top, right? Not exploitative.
It seems that the kind of the meme term is like midwit or midwittery. It seems to select for all these midwit scientists that there's not really anything special about gain of function that I can see happening now. Like you said, we're not really learning a lot, and it's not really these geniuses that are doing this stuff, right?
No, it's not. It's not. And they're midwits because they're the people who are happy to go along with the system, right? Like, the reason why Albert Einstein came out with his great ideas is because he didn't want to go along with the system, right? If you just have a system, like you got Tony Fauci on the one side of the thing controlling the money supply, and you've got the scientific journals on the other side of the thing controlling who gets into the high profile journals. You basically, it's very difficult as a scientist to avoid that system, to avoid pandering to either of those two incredibly powerful forces. Really, really difficult. And so the people who end up leaving science are the people who actually think there's something really interesting about science, but they can't break through the system, right? You've got a horrible, horrible system there.
We're going to get you right back to the episode, but I just wanted to let you guys know of a few other things we offer at Rare Candy Industries. We have a Substack with free and paid subscription options. Free subscribers get access to all written content. That includes Bob's Red Pill. That's the best thing going on the internet right now. Trust me. Paid subscribers get full access to our premium episode feed. And that's just every episode we don't necessarily want to share with the general public, if you know what I'm saying. Again, that's rarecandy.substack.com. We also have merch. That link's a little long for me to say right now, but go to the description, go to our merch store, and find a shirt that's right for you. We have Rare Candy shirts, Dr. Bronner soap label shirts, Rishi mushroom shirts, all types of stuff there. Check it out. There's got to be something for you. And lastly, check us out on social media. On Instagram, we're Rare Candy Pod, but on Twitter, we're at Rare Candy Pod 1. All right, enough of that. Let's get you back into the episode.
You've always been focused on, for lack of a better term, like philosophy of science and what it means to do science. And I remember you saying to me privately before that a better system would just be have smart people in universities, scientists sitting around talking and just coming up with ideas rather than this lab bench grind system that we have just over and over again. And and also the public seems to think that's what science is the tools and the techniques, right, and all the, the arrays and assays and things. But it's not though, right? It's not really what science is. And I remember T. Colin Campbell saying science is the art of observation. So it is clearly we're not sending our best or teaching these kids going through the system what it means to actually do real science in practice, right?
No, I mean, the problem in part begins with the educational system, right? We select for children who don't question stuff. We select for children who are timid. We select for children who are satisfied with extremely boring educational process. Yeah. And then when they finally get to college, they get it even more, right? And then in principle, when they go into a scientific lab, all of a sudden they're supposed to be creative geniuses with, looking out for, being resourceful, checking out new techniques, using their brains really properly. But that doesn't happen, right? Because by the time you've got to the post-degree stage, the system has weeded out all the people with an ounce of gumption.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the people who enter into science are basically the people who can't find another job quite often, right? Or who are not smart enough to be a Bill Gates or whatever and quit Harvard halfway through because you got a better idea. Do you know what I mean? Those people don't enter into science. And so, in the old days, science was a very self-selected thing. You had your Einsteins and your Darwins, and they went into science because they had special things they felt they could contribute and whatever. And it's become more and more professionalized, more and more dull, more and more top down, more and more there's no one but breaking any paradigms anymore, right? There's all these the paradigms of research, it doesn't matter if you talk about cancer or if you talk about Alzheimer's disease or you talk about plant genetics and crop breeding, or if you talk about virology, what's happening is a paradigm that's evolved is basically there to suit the big interest lobbies, right? The food industry, the chemical industry, the ag industry, the pesticide industry. Like, it's basically who will not rock the boat, right? What paradigm is the least threatening to those interest groups, right? It's not about helping animals, or that's why you have so much animal research, right? It's basically animal research is a kind of there's several aspects to animal research, I guess, that would be fun to discuss. But basically, if you do all your testing on animals, you don't learn about people, right? All these organisms are so different from each other. Like if you take SARS-2 and you put it into a mouse, or you put SARS-2 and you put it into a macaque, or you put it into all these different species, it behaves completely differently, right? There's no overlap often between how the virus responds in one and how it responds in the other. So like, what are you learning when you're putting these viruses or these chemicals or these foods into a mouse, right? You're learning nothing, right? But you can pretend to learn stuff. You can pretend to say that you've found stuff out. And if you're not very fussy about what that thing is, then it can be fed into basically any paradigm.
And I guess in that thing is the solution testing on humans though? That's what I wonder. People balk at that. People get a little scared. I myself included. So what do you think? I mean, I guess that's kind of why people say animals.
Yeah, you are testing on humans, right?
Good
but
point.
You're just not collecting any data.
No control group.
Right? There's no control group, right? That is what you're doing. You basically, you give your new pesticide to 50 mice, and then you roll it out to the human population. But you don't collect data, right? We don't collect data because we don't want to know what happens.
It's already rolled out. It's already rolled out.
Basically.
There's no need to collect data. It's already gone through. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And even the 50 mice data is fabricated, and they lie about that too, right? That's
that is also a thing. It's
crazy.
It's incredible how much fraud there is in pesticide regulation. It's all fraud basically.
Well, a big thing that's happening right now is this avian flu that's coming out. I'm cross my heart. I'm lucky enough to have it not be suffering from it yet, but I know a lot of people that are. And it's just you see these stories of just however many it was a very unsettling number of livestock that got just absolutely, I mean, essentially like subsidized to kill, essentially, to get through to basically we'll pay for you to kill these chickens, and then you conversely you go to Trader Joe's or wherever and you just don't see any eggs, or they limit you in these. There's just I find that these things just always seem to get rolled out at odd times, and just the amount of people that are fine with just killing that much livestock. And if we're researching this much on animals, like you're saying, it seems like a really weird reaction to have, where it's like actually just kill everything. It seems so primitive,
But it works for the industry, right? Because they get to do their business as usual, right? I mean, what you've got with these flus quite often is that these giant CAFOs, they are gateways to respiratory infection, right? So they start off in birds as gut viruses, right? But then you've got these animals that are basically living in their own shit.
Yep.
Right? Which helps the virus basically transition from being a gut virus to a respiratory virus. And then when it becomes a respiratory virus, it can become a human pathogen. Right? That's what's happening. That's what's being replicated in all these scenarios. But they don't want to, no one in agriculture much wants to change the system of CAFOs, where you have 10,000 pigs or 10,000 cows or 10,000 chickens on one farm, right? But that is a selective, in chickens, for example, we know that there's like a threshold below which the flu viruses cannot become basically pandemic, right? In those chickens. And if you have more than, the number is about 6,000 chickens, right? If you have an infection with 6,000 chickens, that's enough for the mutations to build up from the bird virus to become a respiratory pathogen. And if you don't have that many chickens, then you can't do that. And so basically everybody with their backyard flocks is safe for people, and everybody with a flock more than 6,000 chickens is a risk, right? But no one wants to solve that problem. The problem they want to solve in the system, in the universities and in big business, is how to drive out the little guys, right? So they use these infectious disease episodes to create rules to drive out small farmers.
Yeah. That's what I'm seeing, is that they'll foam a bunch of birds, and obviously the big guys can survive it, or they just get subsidized. And there are people I've seen on Twitter that they lose their family farm because some Kafka-esque.
You can't take that hit. They can't take the hit.
They can't take the hit. And the PCR cycle, no one knows what cycles they're using on the birds, right? Isn't that another factor in this?
The answer is I don't know. I'm not really the flu person. I just know some big picture things about these flu viruses. And you pretty much exhausted my knowledge at this point.
And I'll be the paranoid guy. It's very strange that this happens right as the HHS secretary, who claims, I mean, look, we'll have to see it implemented. I mean, but his whole claim was, we need to give small farmers a chance, small local farmers a chance. And then all of a sudden you're just like, well, actually kill all your chickens. Again, not accusing anybody of anything particular, and I'm not putting this on the doctor to say that that's the case, but these always seem to be timed perfectly. These things, like when something is being rolled out, like if you just, like you said, science is best when it's just observational, noticing things, and then conducting said experiments. It's just like I don't know, very strange that happened.
I wouldn't go with you in terms of the flu as rolling out, right? But I would say that there's an underlying narrative, right? Of like, there's bird flus flying around the world of different strains and so forth, and occasionally they're useful to different interest groups.
Yeah.
Right.
The response.
So then they induce, they encourage the media, they encourage researchers to go public with all their concerns and whatever. So there's a lot of opportunistic marketing and pushing of PR narratives and so forth going along. That has to be considered alongside the actual reality of bird flus circulating, certain animals getting sick, certain things going into people that are, in a sense random, but in a sense very predictable, right? And so we have to balance those two narratives because both are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And so you have to, it's difficult to do that, right? We don't have access to all the facts. Like, if the USDA is not testing animals for bird flu, right? Then what are we supposed to make of it when it appears in one place or another place or whatever as a human infection or a big media story about some child who gets sick or whatever? It's really difficult to actually, for us to pass what really the underlying story is, and so it's better in some ways just to stick to the big picture thing of big farms are bad and small farms are not bad. That kind of thing is a huge take home from these things. But how it's all treated and whose interest groups need to be shut, which ones need to be shut down, which ones need to be controlled, which ones need the Health and Human Services Secretary to get them to bring them into line, is the big question. And it's not even clear. I mean, let me give you an example. When I heard this talk about the chickens and the number of chickens that you need to get basically circulating. There's similar stories with pigs, right? You can get endemic viruses with pigs. Let me tell you the pig story because it's interesting.
Sure. So
what happens on pig farms is that these flu viruses come in, and like most viruses, like SARS-2 for the most part, and almost every virus, you can only catch it once. Right? When you get a virus for the second time, it's almost invariably because either there's something wrong with your immune system, didn't learn from the first episode, or the virus has changed a bit. Like the annual flus that come in, right?
Sure.
Every year, it's because it's a new variant that's spreading in the population. The same with the variants of SARS-2, right? You had to have Omicron be different from the preceding viruses to cause another wave, right? Yeah. This is a standard thing. But the way they organize pig farming is that there's always a new generation of animals being introduced into these farms which are susceptible, right? And those are the piglets, right? So they're continuously bringing piglets into these things which then become the vehicles for new rounds of infection, right? So you've got this whole kind of cycle going on. On the one hand, you've got chickens where there aren't babies around, but they have a certain size, which can size of flock, which can select for new kinds of viruses, right? And so you've got a story around that, and then you've got a story around the pig farms where you have baby pigs all continually being introduced, right? They're being born and they're being introduced, and they are basically to become the reservoir. They become the susceptible reservoir. So you've got all the stuff that we know about farms, big farms, small farms, and how they incubate viruses. And yeah, the lectures that I've heard about this have all been at European virology conferences, right? I've been to a ton of American virology conferences. You don't hear those kinds of lectures, right? There's a better balance of power, it seems to me, in European virology, where there are always questions about big farms and so forth. There's still an active debate. Whereas in the US, it's like there's no debate. There's like, we're going to have big farms, come what may. Do you know what I mean? And the number of small farms is much relatively smaller. And the size of the biggest farms is way bigger. And the quality of the food is way worse.
Yeah. We have big pharma and big farm. So those are the two things we have. Now, Robert F. Kennedy's in now. Are you confident at all that he's going to be able to make some changes to at least our dependency on these massive farms that clearly is giving us multiple problems other than some of the stuff that a lot of people already know?
I mean, in a sense, it's not his job, right? He's Health and Human Services,
Yeah.
not USDA, right?
Yeah.
You know, if I wanted a job in the Trump administration, which frankly I don't, but I would want to be the agriculture boss.
I'd vote for you. I'd want you.
Right.
I'd want you in.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people who'd be pretty happy to have me as an agriculture secretary.
Yeah.
But the big pharma and big ag would not be.
No.
But what I would do is, you know, you can do so much good as the agriculture secretary. You know, by the time you get to human services, people are already sick. That's what the problem is, right? His role in prevention is minimal, and so there's, you know, he can change the research system that we just talked about, right? That is in his purview.
Yeah.
Right, to persuade universities not to hire people just based on their citations and not get people's be valued according to their citations.
Yeah.
But that presumes that you have a body of knowledgeable professors who know how to hire people, right? And that's not. I think it's unclear that that's the case anymore, right? It used to be in the old days that research professors were, as a group, smart enough and disinterested enough to know who were the good researchers and who were not, right? And nowadays, I think it's unclear, right? I read so many papers about SARS-2, for example. I read papers about SARS-2 every single day, just about, and you can see the stupidity often shining through these researchers, right? And it's partly, there's a ton of different reasons for it, but partly it's because they're being selected to push the line of it didn't come from a lab.
Yeah.
Right. And so who wants to go along with that? Right. You have to be, in a way, if you're a midwit, it makes it much easier to go along with that. Right.
Yeah.
But then you've got a community of midwits. How are they going to recognize the people who are really good?
Yeah.
Right. They probably are not. And so that makes the reform difficult.
Yeah. I think you've had some critiques about RFK, not from the relatively insane, this new thing where people are just freaking out on him and it's clearly no substance. And I wrote a little piece on this, and my whole thing was, my takeaway was, I'm not 100% confident that a lot is going to get done with this administration regarding HHS and RFK, just because of these power structures that are so deeply embedded. But maybe it'll move the needle just a little bit, and maybe move the Overton window just a little bit, and maybe some documents get released, and we can really kind of set us up for the next 20, 30 years of changes that we can maybe make to this system. But I think you'd mentioned in passing that you had some critiques of maybe RFK's book, but it wasn't from like the Elizabeth Warren screaming at him during the confirmation side of things and all that. Do you want to, if you're comfortable, do you want to talk about that briefly?
Sure.
Or do you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
because I don't think I ever heard it. I'm curious because I've been following him for since I was I've been on his email list or whatever since I was a teenager, and I like his environmental work and his vaccine stuff generally. So I'm curious to hear what you think about all that.
Yeah. I mean, I have not followed, this is a disclaimer, right? I have not followed every single thing that he's done or read everything that he's written. Yeah. But, I did read his, I think it was called Wuhan. Probably got a copy. The Wuhan cover-up. It's right on the back here. So the, and there were mistakes in that, right? It was a curious book, because it's quite encyclopedic. It's very impressive. He understands a lot about virology research, and obviously has followed it, unless it was totally ghost written or something. But he's obviously followed it and has a lot of good insights. And then there's a bunch of elementary errors in it, which is really difficult to understand. Why?
He needed you. He needed you to proofread
needed
it,
a
right?
fact checker. Just needed a fact checker.
Yeah.
And because everybody, if you write a huge book
Yeah.
referencing 10,000 papers or whatever, you're going to make some mistakes, right? There's just no brain is big enough to do that. So why not get a fact checker? It's kind of a sad thing, really. And I don't think it really speaks to his lack of knowledge. I think he's just some small things escaped him or whatever. So, but basically the book is good, right? It has a cogent analysis. It has a broad understanding, and he's not afraid to call things out and call people out for, the whole history of American virology is pretty insane. There's like so many bad experiments, so many accidents, so many disasters, so many corrupt researchers. That stuff has to be named, right? And that's the book is really good from that perspective. But the small mistakes they're frustrating,
right?
Is what they are. But as
the general thrust,
pardon me.
The whole that he claims like Fauci and those guys are basically bioweapons guys. Is that relatively? Is that thrust?
I think that's a reasonable take on the whole thing. Yeah.
Wow,
interesting.
But, I mean, they don't want all this, but they want the research, right? And they continually talk about countermeasures and war fighters, and it's going to help the military. And you can see that as soon as a virus is named as a category 4 pathogen and so forth, all this like money gets thrown at it and stuff. And this has to do with military thinking. Even if it's not technically inside the military, it's military thinking. When Ralph Barrick writes his papers in Nature, and instead of calling things treatments, he calls them countermeasures.
Wow.
Right? That's like you're thinking like a warfighter, right?
Yeah.
And so irrespective of exactly where the money comes from, the mindset is clearly that, right? The diffuse grant, which your listeners might be familiar with. I mean, it was written to DARPA. Zhengli Shi, people from Wuhan Institute of Virology, are on a grant that's written to DARPA. But none of them is colonels in any army or whatever, but they think like military people. And you have the Operation Warp Speed, right? It's being headed by a general, right? Like there's all these none too subtle science, right? And if we looked at all this stuff in China, right? If we said, their vaccine projects are being headed by generals and they're using these militaristic words and getting all this government military money, we would say, well, that's bioweapon research, right? But when it happens in the US, we don't call it bioweapon research. We think that people who say it's bioweapon research are crazies and shouldn't be head of human services.
Yeah, and you even think about, I mean, now that you say that too, there's also the other line of some people who think about lab leaks and stuff. They bring up Fort Detrick. I don't know enough about it one way or another, but military facility, like nonetheless, like the connection could be made. You're like, wow, it's all military, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, those I don't know if you know anything about the Ebola outbreak of 2014. But as soon as those people, various U.S. citizens got sick, or people came to the U.S. and with Ebola virus, and you read the scientific papers about what happened, because they're basically case descriptions of what treatments they were given and so forth, and like half of the people credited on these papers are from Fort Detrick. Right,
and that's crazy.
So like their expertise in Ebola virus comes from Fort Detrick.
Right? Was that North Carolina or
there was one in Texas?
Texas. Okay, yeah.
I always thought it was Virginia, but
Virginia.
Anyway,
there was more than one. But
it's on our line, inside our confines, basically of the U.S. Yeah, one way or another. Yeah, that's so weird.
Yeah.
From the 5 to the 6, we be in the mix with that red candy paint job on the whip. I need food for the kids, money for the rent. Fuck a lockdown, baby, can't do that shit.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say if we could switch gears to maybe a less controversial topic, AIDS.
No.
No, no, I, I don't know anything
Me
about
neither.
the AIDS thing. I know there's weird stuff going on with it. I know some people take it really far.
Duesberg. I know words. Like I
Word-
know
yep.
Duesberg. I know certain things that like
And the Fauci atrazine or
Right.
ATZ or not atrazine, ATZ.
Yeah.
AZT.
Probably
And
that.
then also Luc Montagnier, the French scientist, has a bunch of wild stuff. He's always saying stuff, and I'm kind of like, oh, that sounds cool, and I'm not sure if I can trust him. I just want to hear your AIDS 10,000-foot overview.
Yeah,
what's going on here?
I'm interested. I'm interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that it's kind of like the Ebola story that I maybe talked about before, right? You
Okay.
basically got a series of very unfortunate coincidences, right? You have a million years before the advent of the 1950s, when no HIV viruses entered the human population, right? Like we were hunting, monkeys of all different kinds and living with them and living in caves and, doing all this stuff.
Right.
No HIV viruses, right? In the 1950s, 4 different HIVs moved into the human population.
Oh, wow.
And then since then, no HIVs have moved into the population. And you ask yourself, what interesting special things was going on in the 1950s, right? And the answer is that the oral polio vaccine researchers from the US, but also from Europe, were doing mass vaccination campaigns in Central and Western Africa using monkey kidney cells from monkeys that they call it locally to grow up the virus.
Of course they were.
Right?
Wow.
Millions of people had needles stuck in them, right? From those vaccines. Right?
Locally in Africa, I assume sub-Saharan Africa, using local monkeys to culture the polio virus.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
And they got live virus, right?
That adds a whole new flavor to the vaccine debate, if true.
Yeah. What? Yeah. That's as soon as you started saying, as soon as you started mentioning the 50s and polio, I was like, oh no! Like, of course it is.
Yeah.
Right. So,
because I know about SV40, I think a lot of people in the mRNA debate now know about SV40 and promoters and things like that. But that's a whole different can of worms. I feel. Yeah.
Well, we don't know how many people died from SV40, but we do know that 50-odd million people have died from HIV.
Yeah. And the party line, of course, is that SV40 from vaccines we don't have any evidence that it caused any deaths in any person. Right?
Yeah,
I'm switching subjects.
That we haven't looked that hard either.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. It's funny. Are you familiar? And Glenn will laugh at this, Glenn, because Glenn put me onto this. You know about Ricky Gervais, Jonathan, the comedian.
I know who he is.
Yeah.
He has a pretty funny bit about scientists and AIDS. I would butcher it, Glenn. Do you want to?
His big, Gervais' big, his stand-up comedy is very like a TED talk. It's very, it's like a lecture where he weaves in and out of it. And at one point in my life, I really, really liked him a lot. And he talks about it where, talks about a guy, having relations with a monkey, and then all of a sudden we have AIDS. AIDS takes over the world and stuff. And he's not trying to make a big scientific point here. He's just for comedic effect. And he talks about how much it just became like a pamphlet culture. And that one guy was like trying to say, all right, I have 9 ways that you can prevent, AIDS. And then the guy's like, well, we need an even 10 because who can put 9? Like you have to have 2 rows of 5.
2 rows of 5.
And then I forget what the 10th one is, but it's this absurd thing. And it's
the 10th one is like sleeping with a monkey, right? That was his whole bit where something like that, where he's like, and he's like, I don't know, just put it on there, sleeping with it. It's like
he said it's 4:59 and my assignments due at 5.
Yeah.
Just put the 10th one on there.
Yeah.
It's really funny. But to be honest, like now that you're talking about this, I'm like, was that onto something?
Yeah.
Just that neither here nor there. But I mean, how do we get there are some interesting theories about AIDS from our, Sci circle and stuff, where there are people that talk about it being this this thing that doesn't actually, maybe I'm getting their take wrong, so I take this with a grain of salt, but saying it's not real. There's a Duesberg hypothesis that says a lifestyle of drugs, partying, unprotected sex, here and there, all of these things happening create somewhat of a death spiral in a sense, which I think is true. And then people are given bad medication while they're suffering from these things and then dying. And a weird case of that is a guy like Miles Davis. You can look it up anywhere. The great jazz musician Miles Davis was given AZT on his deathbed, and then he just died. And
did he have HIV?
They say no. There's no confirmation of that, but he was one of those guys. He was born anemic, I think. He had just all sorts of struggles, did a bunch of heroin, didn't eat very good for his whole life. You're talking height of jazz music style lifestyle, just really not doing well. And on his deathbed, which he wasn't too terribly old, I don't think. I think he was maybe 60. And then he was given AZT, and that's like just put in there, not by a conspiracy theory site. That's on his like regular, biographies and stuff. Like, it's in there. I just wonder, like, where do you stand on that? Like, this, I feel like you think the virus itself is very much real.
What's the connection with HIV and AIDS, the disease and the pathology? And it seems, and maybe we could parlay this into a broader terrain theory discussion, which I think both sides get quite wrong.
Yes.
And I don't know. It's just confusing. It's so confusing. I've never understood it.
Did you, by the way, ever get anybody to talk about terrain theory on your show?
No, they never
want to debate. That's my problem, is they always freak out. And I'm always like, dude, I'm not here waving a foam finger. I don't have a side. I just want to hear two people talk about it and see what comes of it. And you were more than willing. And there were a few people, or I think just one main one. I'm not going to put his name out there, but I just remember it's just they didn't like the framework. There was all these debates over framework, and I'm not saying you can't have a properly framed debate. I think you do need to have a properly framed debate, but people that obsess over the micro framework of it, I'm always like, are you actually ready to say something, or are you just balking?
No, they weren't ready to come on. No,
get them. Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, because what they say is indefensible, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who have independently isolated COVID-19 from cells. The people have often, many researchers have gone to individual patients and taken the COVID out of them and shown that it's COVID and sequenced it and so forth. The theory has no legs whatsoever. Right. And in my opinion, the HIV doesn't lead to AIDS theory has no legs either.
Okay.
It's not tenable. I mean,
I've never been attached to that position. Yeah, and it's a bummer because a lot of those guys do have good points. I follow some accounts that are and they make great points about medications and virology in general, but they're kind of they rest on the virology aspect of it. And there's a lot you know better than anyone that virology is rife with fraud, but they take it pretty far. And my whole thing with terrain theory, just really quickly, was always that the health of the organism mattered in the disease factor. That's it. That you can do things, different from vaccines or treatment or antibiotics or whatever that result in healthy human, healthy family, healthy population, a community that can prevent a wide range of these pathologies that hurt people or curtail the most negative effects. That's all it ever was to me. And then I think they just take it way too far, but I don't know. Curious your guys' thoughts on that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think AIDS is one of them. People just keep saying it kind of has to be the result for these people because they've dug themselves so far in, which is I'm trying to fight that in terms of science as a whole, even from the complete other side. We see these people, it's this result that has to happen, make it happen and publish it. And it's well, these people are arguing in a more grassroots fashion, I feel like. So you're kind of sympathetic to it, or at least I am kind of sympathetic to it a little bit, but also it's you can't, the beauty is just getting the result and finding out what it is and then acting from there, not just having this expected, this is the conclusion because these 4 other viruses I've determined don't exist because of X,
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to virology, especially things like HIV, right? Yes. There was some justification because HIV is a very complicated and long-term illness.
Okay.
right? Like, what happens when people get sick is that, they get ill in the very first stages of having been infected, right? Before your immune system kicks in, the virus goes rampant, people get sick, and when they have unprotected sex, they can pass the virus on, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then what happens is the virus, the immune system stamps on the virus, basically eliminates it from the bloodstream and so forth, and it just lurks in a few immune cells as a DNA virus, right? Not even as an RNA virus. So it's basically hidden, and you cannot even tell that somebody has HIV, but sometimes decades, right?
Wow.
But then the virus starts to like undermine the immune system, and as it comes kind of freewheels into this bigger and bigger infection, because it's progressively undermining the immune system, and every time it undermines the immune system, then the virus gains another foothold, and it eventually overwhelms the person, and at that stage they become infectious again, right? But you've got a very complicated situation where there can be no correlation between the amount of virus and how sick someone is, and whether they've actually got the virus in the first place, and so on and so forth. There is an excuse for that. Whereas COVID, is a fairly simple illness. You get sick, it goes up in your nose and your lungs, and then you get rid of it. And there may be people with long COVID and some complications, right? Like you can detect virus in people, or virus RNA in people, after they're no longer infectious and don't seem to be sick anymore, sometimes for months. So there's always little complications, but as a virologist, I would say that every virus is kind of unique and doesn't necessarily fit into a very simple paradigm of somebody gets sick and they have a lot of virus, and then they're not sick and they have no virus, and that's all there is to it, right? That's not usually how virus infections really work. And there was all this confusion at the beginning, which I think was genuine, about the fact that people can be asymptomatic and transmit the virus. Like that was a surprise to lots of people, because SARS-1 wasn't like that, right? Basically, the people who transmitted were actually sick. Right. And they felt sick, you could see they were sick, and so on and so forth. And SARS-2 was importantly different in that way.
Okay, I see. So now with HIV, in the 80s, in the 80s is largely when it becomes this mainstream, everybody talking about it. I wasn't alive in the 80s, but from what I gather, just from people that were around, it was kind of this thing that was being discussed, but also kind of taboo. And look, we were at different times socially. There were a lot of people saying, well, that's happening in those areas. Whatever's coming to them is coming to them. So there were a lot of people that necessarily didn't want to address it at all. But it definitely, and I'm from the Bay Area, and my mom talks about like knowing people in San Francisco in the 80s, and she's like, it was just really scary. Like you would just see people wither up and die from it. It felt different than any other sort of, people are 27 years old, 28 years old or whatever, just shriveling up and dying. And yes, people were partying. Yes, people were drug users and stuff. And yes, they were having unprotected sex. All of these things are true. However, that people were also doing that 20 years prior, maybe behind closed doors, and we just weren't having the same reactions. So it's just, like there's obviously this new thing, and tracing it from 50s Africa is quite interesting. Is there a connection there? Like what's happening?
Well, from my memory, what happened is that, European, there was a Haiti connection, right? Of people going from Africa to Haiti, and then people from Haiti going to New York and so forth.
I see.
But there's a lot of nuances to this. For example, in Africa, HIV is mostly a heterosexual disease, right? And in North America and in Europe, it basically spread in the gay community. But that's just like because it can move faster between people who have those kinds of intercourse than it can between people who have heterosexual intercourse. It just is a more probable thing. And the other more probable thing is drug use, right? Sharing needles is AIDS, right? So it basically spreads, in a sense, independently in these two communities. But in the meantime, there is still the heterosexual transmission of HIV that is happening still in Africa and still, happens outside, obviously breaks out, but the pathway is more complicated and it's more difficult. And so, it was and it wasn't a gay disease, basically, at the time. And so it's not, so there's a lot of, I'm not directly answering your question, but I'm answering the question, answering the question I know. I mean, we don't really know how it got. I mean, the bottom line is we don't really know how it got from one country to another. But what you can see is that different viruses broke out in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Right? Mm. So that's an interesting thing, right? That tells you that different people took the virus of different kinds and spread almost from point sources, right, to those communities. So in Asia, they had a different HIV than that exists in Africa, and different again to the one that exists in North America. So there was relatively few point sources at the beginning.
I see. Well, and I mean, I don't know. I think I get it in a sense. Like you're talking San Francisco, what's right there? The Pacific Ocean. I mean, it's, people come in and out of the Pacific Ocean and all of that. It's a very big metropolitan city. And then in, New York, basically it's San Francisco East and vice versa. I mean, it makes sense and all of that. I just, for me, like now what HIV is now is a lot different. It's just a lot different. You don't nearly have as much of a panic, but we also have this pharmaceutical called PrEP that people take, which is effectively allowing you to, I don't know the terms. You're allowed to live a certain lifestyle a certain way. Apparently it's basically a prophylactic for having the HIV virus or something, to where maybe you can't spread it to someone else, or I don't know exactly. So I find it interesting that like we don't really eradicate it though. Like, and I don't know if you can, I'm not sure, but it's like now you kind of just treat it as though anybody could have it. There's a push to get people who, as you said, in North America, it's typically in the homosexual and intravenous drug use, community is typically where that's spread a lot. But you'll see on bus ads, it'll just say like, anybody needs to take this PrEP pill. Like if you're a married man with your wife or something, you need to be taking this pill. And I'm like, what is happening here? How did we go from like complete AIDS, like apocalyptic panic, to just like, you can have HIV, it's fine, but everyone should take it so it never actually becomes a thing? I don't know.
But there's a parallel with COVID, right?
Yeah.
Like it was this huge thing, right? Like 4.5 years ago, and now like no one cares.
Yeah.
And it's an overshoot thing is going on in part, right? There was overshoot about the panic in the first place, right? The HIV did not spread to everyone. COVID did spread to everyone, but it didn't turn out to be very bad in the end. And the other thing about COVID, of course, is that once you've had it once, you're semi-immune to it, right? Even if you get a new version of the virus, it's not going to be so serious because you've already had the first virus. And maybe even there's a benefit to the vaccinations, right? I'm not going to say there's a lot, but there's some, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't know, because I've seen, like, I had it twice. One time, I was delayed. I didn't get like the first wave of it. I never took the vaccine, but the first time I got it, it knocked me out for a day. I was like, "Whoa, man, my knees hurt." Like it just felt like I was like in a car accident in like days.
Yeah.
It was a very strange. Felt synthetic the whole time. Never felt anything like it. The second time I got it, it was like just kind of like rest for a little bit, and then I woke up the next day and I was like, I'm gonna go for a walk or something. Like I feel kind of good, And then like the people I know that were just getting booster upon booster upon booster, they kept getting knocked on their ass by it, like every time. Not dead, and to them they didn't die, so it works.
Yeah.
So it was just like this strange thing. It kept just happening over and over and over again. Then they said they would have to take Paxlovid, all of these things, because they're kind of in that hamster wheel of pharmaceutical intervention. But anyway, that's beside your point. But I was like, I kind of expected to get hit hard the second time, but knowing how to treat it, and it just didn't,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of happenstance in all this, right? If your immune system did the best possible job, and you really just by happenstance developed the right antibodies to it, and then your body remembered those, then you'll never really be troubled by it again. When in my case, I got it fairly bad, like ill 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Quite, and stuck on my sofa for a week of that, right? And then the second time round, I was stuck on the sofa, but basically recovered much more quickly. And the third time, I was stuck on I was at my parents', but like 2 days in bed or whatever. That was it. So my immune system made slower progress to combating it than yours did. But basically, one of the big stories of the pandemic is that we all know what happens when a new virus hits a new population.
Sure.
It spreads like wildfire through them, but then the population is immune and there's not much to worry about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like the Faucis of this world will have known that narrative. And the other narrative that they also knew is that when you get a new infection, all you see is the people who get sick and die. Right.
Yeah.
That's all you know about it. Right. They
Yeah.
go to the hospital, they get tested positive for COVID-19. But you know that there's a huge proportion of the population that are getting it and probably not, they're basically underreporting the mild cases.
Right.
So you always know when a new virus enters the population, there's going to be a huge overestimate of the severity of the illness.
Yeah.
Right. So they knew that too. Right. So they knew those two things that are super, super important. But instead of telling everybody not to worry too much and so forth, they instead took those numbers and went crazy with them.
Yeah.
Right. And that's unforgivable to me. There was all these stories about, you may never get immune to SARS-2 and stuff like that. And like there was no basis for that allegation. Right. Like it's just ridiculous.
Or the psyop to pretend that natural immunity doesn't exist. They were immune.
Another huge one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was
their
part
immunology.
of, what they knew. I mean, it's not different from what I said, right? It's basically you just pretend that nothing that people are going to get it forever and that it will be as bad as the first time round. But if we know that now that the death rate of SARS-2 for people under 60 was about 0.01%. And that was for people who never had the virus before. Once they've had it once, it's good. We don't even know what the number is. So low, it's negligible, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now HIV though was considerably higher, right? I mean, that's the way I was. Yeah,
100%.
Yeah.
Right?
So
and you don't get it twice; you just die.
Right. Yeah. It stays with you. I mean, I just remember the big rollout was that like Magic Johnson, right? For like people that you would hear about it as like this largely homosexual intravenous drug user. The churches would say, well, that's your lifestyle, so you get what's coming to you, almost this like apocalyptic revelation thing. But then a guy like Magic Johnson gets it or something like that. And he doesn't seem to have it anymore. I don't know what happened, but like somebody like that doesn't seem to have it anymore. I think the whole thing is crazy because when I was in school, they were like telling you, they really like hammered like HIV protection for people, and they weren't really accounting homosexuality when we were in school either, right? Like, they weren't really they weren't real. I think nowadays they would, but back then they weren't saying, but they were treating it as though like, guys, even one time if you have sex, like you can get AIDS and all of this. But the whole time you look even into it, I mean, they're picking the wrong drugs to treat it, at the time in the 80s. I mean, you have a famous movie, The Dallas Buyers Club, which almost everybody saw, and it won Oscars. And it's all about Fauci making the bad Fauci process. Like it's very strange. Like if you bring that part up, a lot of people then pump their brakes and go, whoa, no, they wouldn't do it wrong. Like, I just, they would never pick the wrong thing, which then manufactures consent for Fauci to run amok during COVID.
Remdesivir, all this crazy.
It's like either the guy's wrong all the time, which you shouldn't be put in power, or something else is happening. I don't know. It's very scary.
Yeah.
I mean, HIV is now a treatable illness, right?
Yeah.
And I think the PrEP that you're referring to, I don't know too much about it, but
me neither.
But if you have HIV as a parent and you become pregnant, you can basically take treatments to basically ensure that your baby will not catch the virus. right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can prevent someone who has HIV and who is in intimate contact with another person from catching the illness. So the prevention, the pills work from that point of view. They have side effects, right? But they will prevent you from dying, way early, and they will also they can prevent your unborn offspring, for example.
That makes
They're
sense.
pretty effective, right?
Okay.
Considering.
Not AZT though. Yeah. AZT doesn't seem to work at all. Like that seemed to have the reverse effect. So I think there's like a kind of a middle of the Venn diagram with the terrain theory people where you do come to a common ground that like they were still like almost killing or at least worsening people with AZT, right? In the 80s.
The answer is I do not know.
Yeah.
I haven't looked into it.
Yeah. So
what do you think about? Are you familiar with a lot of Luc Montagnier's claims?
Some of them. Yeah, I've read some of his papers. Yeah,
what does he say?
He's always saying
I don't see anything in them, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. Because
what does he say? What does he say?
He's saying that there's bits of HIV in COVID-19. He's dead now, I believe. But he was saying that there's bits of HIV in COVID-19. But if you look at his analysis, he's basically saying there's very short pieces of HIV, right? And like, there's only 4 nucleotides, right? There's A, C's, G's, and the RNA are U, right? Yeah. You've only got 4 nucleotides. So random sequences are going to overlap between the 30,000 base pair genome of COVID-19 and all the different HIVs that have ever been sequenced, right? It's not just, I don't even know how big the genome of HIV is, but imagine it's the same size. You're going to have a lot of overlap in short sequences. And if you've got tens of thousands of HIV genomes from all over the world, from different monkeys and so on and so forth, right? Then the pool of HIV genomes that he's claiming are found in COVID-19 is very large, right? So the opportunity for just statistical flukes is real, right?
That seems like an elementary.
For example, what he was also saying is this piece of HIV, this piece of COVID rather, has this HIV sequence in it. And then he would say this piece of COVID-19 has this HIV sequence, but they're totally different from each other. Like one is some strain from Kenya, and another one is a strain from whatever. And neither of them ever used in research and so forth, right? So like, yes, they are sequences that are exactly like HIV, but they're A, not very long, and B, from all these divergent and probably irrelevant strains, and probably you just made that up. Having said that, the lab in Wuhan, right, was using HIV to present bits of SARS-2 to cells, right? So like you basically have this whole system called pseudoviruses, right? If you want to test the spike of SARS-2 for some property, like how does it facilitate entry into cells, you present if you don't want to use an infectious virus, you want to use something that's sort of dead, right? What you do is you take the spike and you put it into HIV or you put it into another virus, and then you use that hybrid virus in your experiment. And the theory is that virus is a dead version of the vehicle virus and a meaningless bit of SARS-2, right? So between those two, you have basically an experiment that you can do in your kitchen, right? That's the theory, right?
Yeah, it's too easy. Yeah, it's too easy.
Yeah.
But so people do these experiments, right? And for better or worse, I would say they're basically safer, right? They're not foolproof, but they're safer. And then, but the Wuhan Institute of Virology was using HIV as the vehicle for doing experiments on bits of SARS-2, right? Or predecessors like bat viruses and so forth, right? So there's something to it from that perspective, but they weren't using the strains that Montagnier was indicating, for example. So like how his theory would fit together from that point of view is totally unclear. And I think what he's saying, and the last issue for me is, no molecular virologist is clever enough to build SARS-2 from bits of HIV.
Yeah.
That,
For those that don't,
why would you bother?
Yeah, for those that don't know that are listening, he's the guy that he won a Nobel Prize for AIDS research, correct? Back in the day.
He was one of the discoverers of HIV.
Okay, and see, he always was interesting to me. I actually wasn't even thinking about his COVID. I didn't even know he had COVID takes.
Me neither.
But he always checked my little hippie boxes because he would talk about water acting as a fluid crystalline structure and things that trigger all the Reddit scientists, but I think there is something there. So he had interesting takes on a lot of different, water memory and also virology in and of itself and stuff. So he's an interesting cat for sure. And I think you're right. He did die. So
no one bats 1,000. No one bats 1,000.
Yeah. It's funny. It's always funny when a guy, and maybe you could speak when a guy wins a Nobel Prize, maybe like Kary Mullis, right? Who wins a Nobel Prize and then subsequently goes against the grain, and everyone has to pretend that he's this total crackpot, and he might be, or she might be, right? But I find that an interesting thing. Or Linus Pauling, or all these people that kind of got acclaim and international fame as a scientist, went against the grain with some ideas. Maybe they had weight, maybe they didn't, but everyone just piles on and kind of attacks them.
And reverse. Semmelweis, right? Semmelweis, washing your hands, when you're getting birth to birth, died miserable. I mean, the guy who's died miserable because he knew an absolute truth was out there, and everybody laughed at him for many, many reasons. And now it's like, I don't think he himself is touted in this crazy thing, but his ideas, it's mandatory to work at McDonald's to wash your hands before doing something. It's just wild. But yeah, please.
Yeah.
He was on to something similar.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. I think I tend to agree with him.
Well, the thing that pissed me off about that is Neil deGrasse Tyson invoked him as a reason to trust science. But if Neil deGrasse Tyson was around back then, he'd be anti that guy. He would not be on Team Semmelweis.
Yeah, he'd have a radio program back then. If they even had that, it would be a radio program about how Semmelweis is actually harmful and doing false science.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a crack.
Infuriating. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's where we're at. It's tough to know.
There's no substitute for forming your own opinion.
Do your own research, some would say.
Your own research. You can do that. Yeah.
It used to be that was definitely stigmatized for a long time. Well, Dr. Jonathan Latham, are you still putting out papers and writing? I haven't seen any of the latest work. That doesn't mean you haven't been doing it, but you were at Bioscience Research Project. Was that the?
So we have a website, Independent Science News, where we put out our main stuff. So the other day we put out some things. So I was a co-drafter of a civil society statement on biotechnology. And one of the things we mentioned was the harms of biotech, including HIV and Ebola and COVID as being most likely products of biotechnology, right? So our statement was a little controversial from that point of view. But I'm totally comfortable with that statement. So we put out this statement basically because there's all this synthetic biology stuff going on, right? With George Church and Drew Endy and all these, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley type people who are, messing around with organisms, trying to have them hooked up to wires and do novel things and build cells from scratch. And there's all this stuff going on, and there's public unease based on COVID-19 and a lot of other bad stories coming out of science and a general decline of trust in science. But what these people want to do is basically say that they're responsible scientists, right? And so these people like George Church and Drew Endy, they have big money from certain foundations to drive a narrative based around, they're going to have conferences, they're going to have big powwows, they're going to claim objectivity, they're going to claim public interest, they're going to claim public participation to say that they're responsible scientists and that we don't need to worry about all these concerns. They want to put them to bed, basically. The point of our letter was to point out that these people are claiming public interest and public participation while actually running these secluded private conferences where they get to invite all the people and no one else gets a look in. And then they're going to write statements and come up with conclusions and write stuff in Science, and it'll be reported in the New York Times as public participation and so forth. And our point is that's not a model for safe conduct of research.
No, most certainly isn't. Well, I implore everybody to go check that out, and we're always gracious for your time, Doctor. We really appreciate it, and we'll catch up another time. It seems like it happens every so often, and we're always happy to hear from you. So on that note, guys, everybody have a safe week, and we will catch you guys next time.